Let's get to more news now. The White House continues the hunt for the anonymous administration official behind that scathing New York Times op-ed. Who done it?
What did Donald Trump say last night when he was looking for the anonymous op-ed writer?
Oh my God!
Play the clip, if you will.
This is so good.
Do we have it?
You know,
listen to him.
He doesn't have it.
Jackie Gleason.
Wow, you some bitch.
The softball right down the middle of the plate.
Oh, I whiffed on that one.
See, you gotta see that.
We'll fix it in post.
All right, I'll go on.
Sorry.
The Times reports that White House officials have been calling around, asking cabinet secretaries if they're responsible. Really?
Yeah.
Do you guys have maybe better things to do? I'm just asking. But it does help build up the big reveal that is taking Donald Trump at his own game so far. One cabinet official has issued a denial. Everyone, with the exception of Chief of Staff John Kelly and Attorney General Jeff Sessions, referred NBC News to the statement from Sarah Sanders that calls the anonymous official a coward. Sanders also denies reports that aides are printing out and delivering the denials to the president directly. My God. She posted the phone number to the New York Times opinion desk and urged people to call in and demand the paper to reveal the writer. Senator Rand Paul reportedly recommended members of the administration be subjected to lie detector tests. And according to the Times,
by the way, Rand Paul, Mr. Civil Libertarian.
Come on now.
Hold them down.
That's painful.
And strap them in. And,
wow. Okay.
Do lie detector
there was
tests.
at least some discussion about that among the president's advisors as well. They also reportedly discussed asking senior officials to sign sworn affidavits that could be used in court if necessary. One outside advisor tells the paper the White House has a list of about 12
So let's
suspects.
talk about that. So Willie, we talked about this yesterday. I mean, if you're the New York Times and you're the editor and somebody comes to you with something like this, it's this significant. It can't be an assistant to an assistant at the National Economic Council. I mean,
he's going to get
it's got to be the vice president, or it's got to be Nikki Haley, or it's got to be the SecDef or Secretary of. I mean, there's only 7 or 8 officials that the New York Times should ever grant. Right? Can we expect that if it's not? I mean, they're not going down. I know Linda McMahon denied it yesterday, but they're not. I mean, you would hope the Times would say it's either Mattis or Kelly, or they'd keep it pretty tight.
Well, the term they used, again, was senior official in the Trump administration, not senior White House official. So that sort of broadens it out a little more than the people you're talking about who are that close to the president on a daily basis. But yeah, I think, if they're going to try to go find this person and they feel like they haven't found them yet, when you look at that list of 27 people, it starts to look like, if you believe all these denials, it may not be one of those headliners that we're talking about. So then you wonder, and the editors of the New York Times were asked on their own podcast, The Daily, yesterday, if they could narrow it down. What does it mean to call someone a senior official, and they wouldn't do that because they thought it would be too revealing. So I guess the answer, John, is that we may not know for a very long time who this person is.
Well, I'm with Joe about this. I think it could be, there's a key element to this, right? The piece of reporting that's new in this piece, the assertion, which is that at an early stage in the administration that cabinet officials were discussing invoking the 25th Amendment. So any cabinet secretary would be in a position to know about that. I think you're right that the Times, because of the gravity of this, would probably not extend anonymity to a junior official, and nor would a junior official be in a position to reliably report in a story like this, which is what that is, reporting, that there had been discussions of that kind. So I think you're talking about, logically, someone who's a principal, whether that's a cabinet secretary or a senior White House official, someone who was, I'm not casting suspicion on someone like a head of the NEC, a head of the NSC, but you'd have to be, for the Times to extend, I would think logically they would have to be someone that senior, and it would comport with the notion that it would have to be someone that senior to reliably assert those kinds of discussions had taken place in the administration. That wouldn't be a junior official at the Veterans Affairs Department. It would be in no position to know about those kinds of discussions.
You would certainly hope not. You would hope it would be one of 8 or 9 top officials. Hey, David, we've heard quite a few people saying so far that the real news of this isn't who wrote it.
Exactly.
But the fact that 1,000 people in the administration could have wrote it. If you have been in Washington, D.C., like I know you have, and we have a good bit since Donald Trump was sworn into office. This sort of talk rang very loosely in elite circles of policy leaders and officials and journalists from day one.
I think that's really the one message, is that although we have this list of denials, the very fact that it's known that there are many, I'd say a half dozen or more people who have been doing what this op-ed describes, have been trying to steer policy in a way that it wouldn't be damaged by the whims and impulsive decisions of the president, that tells us that the phenomenon in the piece, whatever the controversy about who wrote it, is real. Mm-hmm. And I think that in that sense it underlines something we sort of knew, but it just drives it home. Trump's rage at this is in part the rage against a government that he has understood, I think, for months that he doesn't fully control.
Yeah.
I think the question is how much damage this crazy period. Bob Woodward's book quoted somebody's calling it crazy town. You know, living in crazy town after a while gets exhausting and disorienting, and that's what Washington has felt like this week. When you go outside, you went to play tennis last night, somebody screaming, "Who wrote the piece?" Mm-hmm. It's like people are obsessed with this game. People are making bets with bookies. One online bookie said he'd had more than, I think, $5,000 wagered on the names of who might have written this op-ed piece. I mean, what a crazy situation.
Crazy.
And the question is, how are we going to get out of that?
By the way, that bookie also reports that Mike Pence is the favorite, the odds-on favorite.
Mike Pence, who talked about the president's extraordinary leadership yesterday, and it's just kind of hard to watch.
I just say one last thing, which is to Willie's point about you made this said the conditional. If these denials are to be believed, I think we all know that denials of this kind in Washington are utterly worthless. I mean, we have watched how many people have said that we've seen in our careers said, "I am not running for president. I will never run for president. I will serve out my term," and then they're running for president 2 weeks later. In this White House, in particular, in this administration, which has been more promiscuous with the truth than any administration we've covered, I just don't take any of these denials seriously. Not a single one. They're utterly meaningless.
But I actually think these denials are incredibly important, because if you look at can we put them up again, the list of denials that have been issued already, whether they were compelled by the president or voluntarily put out? Look at this. Now, David writes in the Washington Post a piece about surviving Crazy Town, how to stay sane in Crazy Town. But quite frankly, if you look at that long list of denials, David, it's probably very possible that the president is looking at that list and is extremely disoriented himself, because those are all the people that felt they had to issue a denial. So those are all the people who it could have been, which means his entire White House basically doesn't believe in him, thinks he's crazy, does not think that he's able to do his job, and now the president himself knows it because they had to issue denials.
Well, and David, the president's saying that he can only trust his children now.
Well, where are they on the list? And what about Melania, really? So, it's an amazing situation. The president, I'm sure, is going to brood and stew, and the fact that all of those people, basically the entire top rank of his administration, felt compelled to issue a statement. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. It just shows you an administration in some disarray. Now that the way in which business has been managed, kind of, wait until after the tweet, wait for the actual order, don't rush into doing things just because the president made a comment. Now that that's been outed, what's going to happen? And I have a feeling that you'll see, just as in people rushing to put their names on a list, people rushing to show any whim of the president, yes, sir, got it, right on that. And that could change the character of the way the government works, not for the better.
I agree.
And I think that's really going to be an interesting question going forward.
Well, David, it's interesting, though, that the first bit of foreign policy news we get after these revelations is that actually the president is going to do what everybody in the foreign policy community believes he needs to do, and he's going to commit to keeping our limited number of troops and our presence in Syria as a bulwark against Iran, against Russia, against Assad's regime, against ISIS. You've been out there. Let's talk about what an important move that is.
So, Joe, this really is important. Our military in Syria has been, I don't want to say pleading. The military doesn't plead, but they have believed deeply that we would give up hard-won strategic advantage by pulling these troops out. Every presidential statement, what do we need this, has distressed our special forces in particular who were in Syria. And there is now a new policy, and it does have some clarity. They chose one of the most respected diplomats the last 15, 20 years, Jim Jeffrey, to run it, a career State Department officer. They are sending very clear signals to the Russians, the Turks, the Saudis, the Iranians may be most important. The United States is going to play its hand differently. And this period of kind of, let's get out of Dodge, this doesn't matter, that seems to be over, at least for now. So there's an example of good policy being made by a group contrary to the president's initial instincts. He didn't want to do it, but he was talked into doing it. And then here officials saying, Jim Jeffrey said specifically this morning in the Washington Post, I'm confident that this policy has the support of the President of the United States.
All right, let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines this morning. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is in Afghanistan on an unannounced visit. Mattis, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, are meeting with Army General Scott Miller, who took over as commander of NATO troops in Afghanistan on Sunday. President Trump has yet to visit troops fighting in Afghanistan, nor has he visited any soldiers in a combat zone ever. Also making news this November, Americans could elect more than 100 women to the House for the first time in history. A race-by-race analysis shows between 30 and 40 new women are poised to enter the House next January. That would shatter the previous record of 24 set in 1992's Year of the Woman. Currently, there are 61 female Democrats and 23 female Republicans serving in the House. Also, another big story, officials in 5 states are investigating decades worth of sexual abuse claims in the Catholic Church. Attorneys general in Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico, and New York have asked local dioceses for their records in an effort to unearth cases that were potentially covered up by the church. The move follows an explosive Pennsylvania grand jury report that detailed more than 1,000 victims accusing priests of abuse. We will follow that. And still ahead on Morning Joe, Rudy Giuliani confuses the conversation about whether or not the president will answer Bob Mueller's questions. We'll get to that. Plus, Cory Booker looks for a moment during yesterday's Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
What was that?
This is about the closest I'll probably ever have in my life to an I am Spartacus moment.
Yeah. Orrin Hatch weighed in, tweeting, quote, you know, I knew Spartacus.
Well, you know, he was doing the whole Spartacus thing, Willie, saying, I don't care if I get kicked out of the Senate. I am going, we're going to get this information out. It's against all the rules. He got the information out, and then they're like, yeah, you asked us to do it last night, and we released it.
The documents were cleared Wednesday night.
They were cleared Wednesday night.
Cleared.
All right.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.